Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I'm the president of Network 2020. Welcome, everyone, to today's briefing on the future of women and girls in Afghanistan. Before we begin, I'd like to just say a few words about Network 2020 for those who might be joining us for the first time. We are an inclusive international community, and we bridge the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy community. And we run a number of different programs, including webinars like these, as well as private discussions. We also do original research and implement programs. So please do check out our website and social media for more information about our work. When the Taliban swiftly took over Afghanistan in August of this year, one of the biggest questions was what life would be like for women and girls and minorities under their revived leadership. People had reason for concern. Women were barred from public life under the Taliban's rule earlier, and ideologies do not change rapidly. No country has recognized the Taliban as of yet, I believe, and the freezing of its international assets to the tune of about 9.5 billion has led to a humanitarian crisis as the harsh winter sets in. The United States, in its mission creep from uprooting al-Qaeda, spent 2 decades promoting the rights of women and girls, only to abandon those efforts in its hasty exit. What is left is uncertainty of what lives of women and girls will look like and how the economic and humanitarian crisis will further affect their lives, and how the United States, its allies, and even its adversaries approach the Taliban given divergent values and geopolitical realities. We are so fortunate today to have some phenomenal women join us to talk about this issue from several angles. We are waiting, hopefully, for Palwashta Hassan to join, and hopefully she can make an appearance as we speak, but we're going to begin with Lina AbiRafeh, the Executive Director of the Arab Institute for Women and the author of Gender and International Aid in Afghanistan, The Politics and Power of Intervention. She has done a lot of other very interesting work and has been in development worldwide and has a lot to contribute on this topic. And we are also very pleased to welcome Jane Ferguson, who is the award-winning broadcaster for PBS NewsHour. And so because we got started a little late, I really would like to just jump right into the conversation. And so thank you, first of all, Lina and Jane, for joining us. It is really an honor to have you here today. Lina. We're talking about Afghanistan here, but your work has spanned not just Afghanistan, but combating violence against women and girls in many jurisdictions. One of the big crises right now is the economic and humanitarian crisis caused by freezing Afghanistan's international assets. And one question that's on my mind, and I think on the mind of a lot of people, is how does the flow or lack thereof of international aid affect women and girls if they're thrown into this catastrophic situation?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm going to start at the beginning because I started working on Afghan women's human rights in 1996 when I was working in Washington, D.C. on global women's rights and Afghanistan, Afghan women, the burqa, smuggling their cameras to film abuses by the Taliban in their stadiums. And so all of that stuff had captured media attention. So since 1996, we have been talking a very big talk about supporting Afghan women, promoting their rights, funding local groups, providing resources on the ground so they can continue the fight that they've been actually doing all along. And I really want to underscore the fact that Afghan women have always been building their networks, running underground schools, doing whatever it takes in order to survive. And our job has been to fund, to support, to amplify, to provide the tools and resources. And we have never, ever adequately done that. Not then, in 1996, when we started to express concern, nor in the aftermath of 9/11 when we invaded en masse. And we certainly aren't doing it now. The problem is that these women's groups have always been underfunded and shortchanged. So even as the international community came in to provide support, these groups, local groups, never got adequate resources. And now the situation is made all the more serious by the fact that international assets are frozen, as you rightly said. There is a drought that was before the Taliban, the new Taliban takeover.
Recording in progress.
that actually has contributed to a massive humanitarian crisis on a huge scale. So more than half of the population is dependent on life-saving assistance that they're not able to get. And what we know very clearly is that women and girls are always more vulnerable, more affected, more at risk, and will have to find more ways to survive with much, much less. So I'll leave it at that for now. And I know there are a lot of other questions, but I have a lot to say about this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lina. And we will be able to get back to this at some point. I'm also very pleased Palwasha Hassan has joined us. She is the Executive Director of the Afghan Women's Educational Center. Welcome, Palwasha. Are you able to hear us?
Hi, yes. I'm sorry that I'm joining a little bit late, but good noon to everyone. And I'm here with you guys.
Wonderful. Thank you. Palwasha, if you don't mind, I'd love to turn to you right now, because I often like to start conversations with a little bit of scene setting. And so you've advocated for women for years, running the Afghan Women's Educational Center. And as Lina talked about, a lot of this work goes back decades. And you've been working with a range of programs throughout Afghanistan. It's been, believe it or not, I think almost 4 months since the Taliban took over. So what is, from the conversations you've been having with people in Afghanistan, what is the situation on the ground right now with women and girls? And what is your biggest area of concern?
Thank you. I think the situation that I left my country, unfortunately, in a very an emergent situation that happened with Taliban taking the path of conflict and military solution or their own victory, has ended up in a catastrophic situation for many of us on the ground and had to leave the country. But looking back to Afghanistan, I think our heart is full of too much emotion for our country and millions of women and men and children who are, as heard the last words of Lina, that 55% of a population are in verge of hunger. That is so huge for a country where half of the population are starving. This is a big humanitarian catastrophe that Afghanistan is facing, and women cannot be divorced from the whole situation. So it's not only the policies that Taliban has previously prevailed and currently going on, like, as you know, we still don't have education is only okay till primary education for girls, but secondary education in majority of the provinces, it is stopped and no girls are allowed to go to school. Women work is in a stale situation. Taliban are forever thinking for creating that special frameworks that they are talking about. In 6 years of their previous regime, they were not able to come up with that frame. And even now, it is over 4 months now, they still don't have invented the new interpretation of working, which is so different than any other Islamic country, because we have so many examples of Islamic countries from where Taliban merged, Pakistan, for instance, where their hubs have been started, or any other Muslim country, like if you go to Egypt, Turkey, and so many other countries with Muslim population, we are waiting what is their interpretation. But that which is so expensive for women, that is expensive for girls. They are losing their time for learning, for being educated. But also women has been the bigger force of their family support. Only in the beginning of 2002, we had over 2 million widows. And this number has increased due to Taliban own insurgencies. bombardments and other reasons of conflict, that the number has doubled. We have those women to support their families. We have educated class of Afghan women who has been supporting not only their immediate family, but I know several of my friends who has been supporting two or three or other family, extended families through their salaries. Are now they are jobless. Some of them had to flee the country and sitting in other countries. Few days before, I was talking to one of my friends who has now made it to Spain, and she has been crying because she was the only breadwinner for her entire family, her brother's family, her own mother. Several of her family members had no food to have access to, and it was so difficult for her to help her from in the current status, where many of us ended up without being recognized for our status. We are still as a parolee in many countries. Many don't have jobs, and it's difficult for them to maintain the same support tie that they used to their families. But other than that, we should also remember that Afghanistan is a very diverse society, and we had majority of people living in rural communities, but it doesn't mean that women in rural communities had no role, and they have been extensively involved in agriculture and other things, and which is related to rural life. And because of drought, men and women lost that access to support. I think we are all facing a very dilemmatic situation in Afghanistan. I know many policy makers are thinking like how to support. There are few approaches there to support the immediate humanitarian needs of the people, but I don't think that is sufficient or efficient, because some of these are going through UN, and it is expensive for Afghanistan, and in no way it is sustainable. I think we have to go beyond that and find more creative solution to long-term needs of the people. We need also to look to vast majority of Afghanistan, to the rural area as well, and see how the farmers could be supported. But for this whole thing, how women could be involved and this support could be driven through them. So by no means I want to say that the situation currently requires to ignore everything else. We need to insist on push and pressure on Taliban. Somehow it is those pressure, I think, is responding in some places. Not major, but some small breakthrough are there. A few schools or in few areas allowed. That is still an improvement, and we have to build on that, and the pressure should be kept. The political sanction should be there, but there should be continuous political engagement for the reform, for the change that is very much needed for the country, for maintaining the institutions, and for supporting a life-sustaining activities for the people.
That's so wonderful. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say that thank you, Palwash. So that's actually a great place to segue to Jane, to start talking about this idea of how one does put pressure on the Taliban. And, you know, obviously the big geopolitical situation, and one of the big questions right now is how does the Taliban operate in a world that is not recognizing their rules, that doesn't want to recognize them because of largely the treatment of women and girls, and yet there's still this international system out there. So Jane, you know, what have you heard? You know, how does the Taliban operate going forward in this environment? And do you have a sense of how other countries are formulating their decision to recognize or not the Taliban, or as Palwasha mentioned, you know, there's this gray area. You know, how does one keep pressure on the Taliban at the same time while trying to avert this humanitarian crisis?
One of the biggest challenges has been trying to predict how the Taliban would behave after a takeover. And this has been going on since long before they marched into Kabul on August 15th. You know, as soon as the Trump administration signed a deal with the Taliban in February 2020, there was a something of an assumption that there would be a realism. Maybe it was just a hope. It seems to have been now, in retrospect, that the Taliban would realize that running a country would be different from menacing a government as an insurgency, and that to run a country, they will need diplomatic efforts. They need the diplomatic community to stay. They want the aid agencies to send their staff back in, and certainly the money back in. On the ground in Afghanistan, whether or not it's the bureaus of news organizations or embassies themselves, they're being very effectively guarded by Taliban gunmen who were immediately sent into the diplomatic areas and the green zones to protect those buildings and to try to persuade the international community that they are going to safekeep these people. They'll be back any minute now, was sort of the attitude that they're just going to leave and then they'll return. And yet, what we've seen since the Taliban takeover well over 3 months ago is quite the opposite in terms of policies. We're seeing a government that is not afraid to upset even their close ally Pakistan, their hosts in Doha, Qatar, as well as, of course, the wider diplomatic community with their own policies. And so they seem to be shooting themselves in the foot if their main objective is to get aid money flowing in and to get their own government to be recognized. Now, why are they doing that? That's likely because they are under massive pressure from within their own ranks. They've got their own wranglings, they've got their own divisions and schisms, they've got their own hardliners that they have to placate in order not to lose commanders, fighters, and territory to ISIS. So they have their own concerns, and that's likely shaping the kind of policies that shock people, frankly. Banning all girls from school immediately did surprise some people who thought that they might be more realistic about what they were going to have to do. Perhaps that was a naive perspective, but because when we look at what Taliban rule looked like in other parts of the country, we didn't exactly have women going to work or girls going to school. So there's very much so from the Taliban perspective what's going on. It's hard to know exactly how much pressure will be effective, given the fact that for the Taliban, their internal schisms are an existential crisis. So yes, a widespread famine across Afghanistan will impact the Taliban as well as their own communities. It will also place massive pressure on the Taliban. Coming from civilians, the last thing they need is 38 million people with nothing to lose, standing next to them in the street and saying, this is Taliban rule, we're literally starving. They don't want bread riots, but at the same, so there is a certain degree of pressure there, but there's a massive moral problem with that kind of pressure, with pressure and aid money at a time when people are literally starving and hospitals are filling up. So they know that there's also pressure on the international community. They could turn around to civilians and say, this is America's famine. America put these sanctions in place. The Americans are making us hungry. And so they do, and they have been saying that as well. I just got back from Afghanistan and less than 6 weeks ago, and this is what the Taliban are saying. They're saying, we would be fine if it wasn't for this. This is the international community's fault. This is America's fault. And so that's definitely going to be, I think, an increasing talking point. So in terms of pressure, it's very difficult to see, but it's not impossible. You don't make aid money that has anything to do with food conditional, but there have been discussions of, will we fund schools if they're only going to be for boys? Will we fund schools if they won't allow women to work in them? So there, around the edges, there can be some pressure. I think direct pressure from America is probably unlikely to work. But, there are allies that the Taliban need in the region, whether we're talking about Iran or Pakistan. So I think, those countries probably have better leverage.
Thank you so much, Jane. Lina, I'm going to turn to you now, and kind of picking up on what Jane was saying about the schools rapidly closing. We're looking, the women and girls who remain in Afghanistan, they face a future that seems to be curtailed at best and very violent at worst. And so looking beyond these very obvious human rights reasons for caring about this, the broadest question, why should we care? What is at stake in the larger systems that we operate in if women are marginalized or they're abused?
First of all, women's rights is a global problem, and we know that no country has achieved equality. Afghanistan is now the farthest with the widest gender gap. According to the World Economic Forum, the Global Gender Gap Report, Afghanistan is the lowest in the world. So it is a severe problem. At the same time, because this is a global phenomenon, a global problem, these things don't stay neatly confined within their borders. And if we claimed to care and claimed to help, we should have followed through on it. And building on what Jane and Palwasha both said, very rightly so, is that there have been commitments that were not delivered. There was a lot of rhetoric that didn't match reality. But if you look at the US and international partners that spent really 2 decades encouraging women to come out, to study, to work, to go to an office, to run for public office, to be present, to be visible, to be public, and to be powerful. And for what? They never fail to match the level of rhetoric. And I keep saying that women's rights are not subject to international whims or whoever is in power at a certain time. This is not a light switch that you can flick on and off globally or at the country level based on who is in power. These are non-negotiable things, and they have to be delivered. Everybody has a right to fulfill these things, and we have fallen, I think, dramatically short in doing that for Afghan women. And here is the danger of that after 2 decades of so-called support. So, having said that, I think I would differ strongly to Palwasha, who I'm very happy to see or hear, because I think the last time I saw her was 2006. But all of that to say, especially for Palwasha, like we met in 2001. 2002. How are we still talking about this 20 years later? How have we not just failed to deliver on what we expected, but it is a backsliding that for me is unacceptable. And it is a real shame globally to have done that. So what I'd like to see is to find ways for all of us now to do it right, to channel the support and resources to local women's groups who have been fighting on the front lines well before we came to hear about what was going on in Afghanistan, and long after everybody gives up and turns away, because we are very short-sighted in the way that we care and the way that we allocate funding and the way that we commit. And I think those are dangers that we can't afford to continue any longer, because women and girls are paying the price for it.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Obviously, these changes don't happen overnight, and there was a lot that was happening on the ground before the US even came in and with the rhetoric. Do you think that had the US stayed, like, is this a generational thing? Would they have needed to stay another 2 decades, or was that just something that wasn't the issue? It was a different issue entirely.
Well, I think the way the exit was handled was very poor. The way that women and women's rights were thrown under the bus was, just by signing a so-called peace agreement with the Taliban. I think already, you have signed away women's rights and fundamental freedoms and civil liberties and so many things that the country really needed to more significantly build. So, should the US have stayed forever? I'd love to hear what everybody else has to say about it, but I would say there were ways to have a more responsible, accountable, gradual exit. And it was not this. This was sloppy. This was dangerous. It was careless. It was, a sign that we had absolutely no responsibility and no accountability. And to say this was never a nation building project and it was never about women's rights, those things are not true at all. So for me, the danger lies in when there is commitment and when there are promises and those aren't delivered. And I think the exit in the way that it was handled was a clear demonstration of that, washing their hands of a situation that is, to me,
and if I could just jump in there.
Jane.
Sorry.
I know, I'm waiting.
What Lina mentioned as well is like talking during the negotiations for the deal with the Taliban. It's really important that we talk about this rather than, should we stay, should we go, are we forever war people, or we leave no matter what. The thing is, that was the moment when there was leverage, when the Taliban were on the verge of a deal. There was that leverage. The moment for leverage on women's rights was lost at that moment, whenever the Afghan government was showing up for talks with the Taliban, and they were showing up with like 4 women out of a group of 21. You know, like the women just didn't have a seat at the table, sometimes in a very literal sense. And those moments, in retrospect, women's rights were just not really being talked about. And so, you know, women weren't only trying to persuade the Americans to the Afghan women not only didn't have the Americans on, you know, really putting pressure on the Taliban, but they also didn't have their own Afghan government in Kabul really pushing forward for Afghan women's rights. So, you know, it wasn't like they were in a feminist utopia and now they're in hell. Like, they've been fighting the whole time. And that moment of potential leverage, unfortunately, has been lost.
If I
Pawasha, please, and then I want to turn to you with the next question.
I can't agree more with Jane and Lina on this. I think we lost a big opportunity, and women have given warning on that we were expecting a situation like that. From the women has been ready for several years for a peace talk and negotiation where women could be sitting on the table and negotiating for their rights. This opportunity was taken from Afghan in general. The peace deal was between Taliban and US without slightest responsibility towards the country where they have spent more than 17 or 18 years. Nobody has invited United States in that time to come to Afghanistan, but when they were leaving, at least they should have been in consultation with people of Afghanistan, and only adding few months into that process where the US soldiers were not combatant would have made such a big difference for the peace negotiation to be completed. The Afghan government was not given that prestige to be a part of it. And I agree that we had to fight in several fronts. A number of times we prepared our delegation to go to Doha, to have the chance to declare our status, to speak about our issues, to speak about our perspective of peace, and nobody has facilitated us. And there were, at the last moment, visa and other issues which were intentionally put in front of Afghan women to use that momentum in our best interest to protect ourselves and to avoid a situation we are placed right now. But, you know, we can say much about that. We lost all those opportunities. The only leverage at this point is the sanctions, and especially on those people who are on the blacklist. Now that versus the situation where Afghanistan is, this need a very creative, very thoughtful solution so that we don't double harm the people who are on the ground. Those who are facing with every day, like the price of one bread, which was 10 Afghani before, it is 15 Afghani. So it's already like half double of what it was. People, and this is happening where most people don't have salaries, they don't have income from the ground. So how to handle the humanitarian situation on one hand, but also I don't think the state institution or inheritance of Taliban, and we should think like it is their property, and that's why we should let that to collapse. I think that in long run, that will have a bigger impact on the people and the country and the nation of Afghan nation. So all the solutions shouldn't be at this point seen in a very short-sighted, like one-ended help. I hope it was just like matter of few months that the world could have sent some aid packages to Afghanistan to help with immediate hunger. I think we are in a risk of long-term need. In last few years, with international support, I think there has been a lot of economic dependency. Unfortunately, we suffer from corruption and so many other issues, and we were not able to help and to consolidate our economic foundation the way it should have been. And now we're sort of, I don't like to say this for my country, but we are sort of liability of that sense. And that is because of the corrupt governments and politicians which were not able to help that. But also for the world, they never partnered with the right partner in Afghanistan. From Bonn Conference to recent Taliban deal, it was always with warring faction in Afghanistan, and the people and the representative were given the least attention. Now, I think we, as a woman, as a nation, we also have to work and critically look to ourselves and helping with that alternative. But also we have to look at the international community for helping us all these years. Should not let Afghan to die because of a piece of bread. And it will be such a shame for the whole world, for 45 countries who has been involved, and now we are in this situation. We all have to work together and to save men and women and children in Afghanistan by working together. The role of women organization is very critical. I appreciate and thank Lina for bringing that. I think we have women groups all over the country. I know many women has left in fear from Afghanistan, but I think the current humanitarian aid should be packaged in the way that it should be delivered through women organization. It should do twofold thing. Like we need a really comprehensive strategy for aid delivery. For any sanction to be lifted, it should be benchmarked on improvement of women and girls situation in the country. So I start.
Thank you. Well, what I'm going to do now, I'm going to start to pull in some questions from the Q&A box. I still have a couple more questions of my own, but I want to make sure that the audience gets their chance to ask questions. So I'll try to weave some in. So this first one I'd like to direct to you, Jane. And the questioner asks, when it comes to foreign actors with the most influence on Afghanistan, it's Pakistan, Qatar, Russia, and China, not always the United States, and certainly not now. So what leverage, if any, does the United States still retain to make any meaningful impact? And what influence do the countries above have in regards to the future of women and girls in Afghanistan?
On paper, the United States still has leverage, and that's partly because of the sanctions, and the US leading in terms of whether or not it's the decisions made by the IMF or, as a UN donor, or, in terms of USAID funded projects across the country. So on paper, they have massive financial leverage over any authorities in Kabul. But, as we've discussed here already, that is massively impacted by the ethical implications of that, of using that leverage at a time when millions of lives are at stake. So that massively reduces the level of leverage. I wouldn't underestimate, however, how much the Taliban are desperate for the diplomatic recognition. And so whilst obviously the likelihood of them being of a Taliban government being recognized by the United States government is slim to none, that doesn't mean that that doesn't, behind closed doors, have an impact on who does. The United States, so we're going to see, various degrees of removal. The United States is a close ally of Qatar. The United States is a close ally of Saudi Arabia. What will they do? How will they approach their foreign policy towards a Taliban government? It's very likely that they'll be having discussions with the Americans about what they're going to be doing too. So, in the real politics of the region, we're going to be seeing, not just how does America react to the Taliban government, but how do other regional governments react based on how they think America is going to view that. So there's a certain degree of leverage there. But I think that it's going to be extremely difficult to adjust to this new reality of such little leverage that they're really talking about, because we just keep talking about carrot and the aid money and whatnot, and that's because there is no stick really anymore. There's no like, regardless of discussions about over the horizon this and that, there's no real will or readiness or capabilities to get back involved militarily, whether or not that's strikes at all. So, that's definitely going to massively impact the amount of leverage that there is. Beyond that, another thing that is going to hugely limit America's ability to use the leverage that it has technically on paper is going to be the impact that it will have on a humanitarian scale. Even if you do say, look, of course we're not going to prevent food coming in and food handouts, but we're just going to make it more difficult for the Taliban to get hold of dollars. In doing so, you impact livelihoods, and it's livelihoods it's the lack of livelihoods, the collapse of that is making families go hungry. So the difficulty will be, I just don't see how they're going to be able to continue to turn off the spigot completely on cash going into the Afghan economy without having mass starvation issues. So economically, they're really tied. I think diplomatically, that's probably going to be the strongest route in a roundabout way to apply pressure.
Wonderful, thank you. Lina, I'm going to turn to you with this next question, and it might be a tricky one for you. And so the questioner asks, where do we draw the line in terms of our realistic expectations? What are our minimum basic expectations of education, health, and civil rights? So based on your work in a broad variety of contexts, right? I mean, we want to get to here, but if we're here, you know, where should we draw the line? Are there some benchmarks that we should be looking at along the way?
First of all, I'd be curious as to who we is. You know, at the end of the day, this is about Afghanistan, right? And it's about Afghan women and girls. So are we drawing the line or are they drawing the line? And why is there even a line? I mean, are we going to cap it and say, all right, primary education and that'll do? You know, are we really going to lower the bar? I mean, first of all, the line is not for us to draw. And if we are committed to helping, then we need to make sure that we provide, like I said, the tools and the resources in a meaningful way, both human and financial, to enable Afghan women and Afghan women leaders, Afghan feminists and Afghan women's rights groups to get to where they want to go. And that is going to take a while. This is not a quick fix. I mean, I'm sitting here in New York. We are nowhere near equality on anything. You know, please look at Texas. Texas doesn't look very different in terms of women's rights and fundamental freedoms. So, you know, this idea that we are dangerously kind of saying, well, you know, it's going to be okay for Afghanistan is not an acceptable conversation to have for me. And what I would like to see is for us to be in it for the long haul. If we're committed to supporting women's rights, that is going to take a while. There are benchmarks at every step, but there's no cap. There's no limit to this. Full equality and rights is the limit. You know, the end to these conversations. We don't even have to talk about this because it is a given and guaranteed and already exists. That's the limit. You know, if I felt like we could achieve this in my lifetime, I'd be delighted. But I think that is my answer to the question.
Fantastic answer. Thank you. Palwasha, I'm going to turn to you now, and this is actually a very good jumping off point. Journalist Anand Gopal wrote an interesting article in the New Yorker a couple of months ago, and it was entitled "The Other Afghan Women." And he wrote about the women largely living in rural communities in Afghanistan, for whom the US withdrawal has been a blessing. They had peace, they didn't need to worry about losing family members, livelihoods, homes. Like, these are the people who seem to be were supporting the Taliban. So how do you respond to that, given the work that you've done throughout the country, and in particular in the context of this conversation? And how would you explain this dichotomy in its full complexity to those of us in the United States or elsewhere who often take a very one-sided view? So is there a bigger picture that we should be understanding?
Generally, I agree with the issue of complexity, but I would not agree with it's such a blessing for the rural community. Unfortunately, conflict hasn't finished. You continue to hear issues of explosions, especially through ISIS. The attacks and all hasn't reduced. We still have personal or targeted assassination of individuals, which is both in rural area that I'm hearing from foreign distance provinces like Pakistan and other places where people are still targeted. So in personal level, you know, those things continue. So there is no rule of law at this point, even if Taliban are behind it or not, but they are not able to maintain security for general public. And then it's also important from what point you say security, because for women, security is very complex. If I have my colleagues who are sitting in Paktikar, they are not able to go to their offices, to their women shuras and communities. How is the rural woman safe? By which definition? I think generally it looks like a very men's definition of security. Yes, the number of attacks may be reduced in some urban centers, but targeted killing continues like that. We still don't have that security for a girl to go to school, for a family to trust that women are allowed to go, even in some places where Taliban's are relatively flexible, still families don't trust because Taliban hasn't made the announcement, yes, you can go to the offices. That's very much important for them to announce that so that family and girls and women can trust. You know, there is an horror, a felt of terror that people remember from the first round of Taliban government, that even in some places where there might be locally things change, but still people cannot trust that. So it's important that that should come as a policy. And I understand for all these years, it was sold on their foot soldiers, like, okay, people are not enough Muslim and all that, with all the suicide bombing and else. For them to drastically change that, it might be difficult, but at least there are many things which within Islamic framework or frame of Sharia, if we compare it to any other Muslim country, Afghans are so much in a modest level, and we have to continue girls' schools, we have to continue with the working condition, and this should come really so obvious from them. Regarding the political pressure, I think it can work and I think Taliban care for that, for their recognition. For some of the changes which happen in certain provinces, or maybe some of the restriction as is not the same level as it was in the previous government. For instance, women are not lashed for modest clothes that they used to wear, for instance, in Kabul. That means they do care for international recognition and also their image. So it is important that those areas should be, those points of pressure should be kept on. I'm not saying a very, maybe there are creative way of doing all this, and there is no 100% solution to anything in Afghanistan with all the complexity of culture, the rural, urban and all that, but there is always leverage that need to be properly navigated. And use those spaces for the support of women in the country with consultation of women. Keeping women in the design of any engagement is important for any solution. And Afghanistan of today is very different because we have women with all sorts of background, from security to education to health, that you have plenty of skillful women who can contribute to all this discussion and design of any program and engagement. So that should be taken in priority, both for women inside Afghanistan and those women leaders who are outside Afghanistan, and maintain the same level of interest and contact that should be developed on.
Thank you. And you bring up an interesting point too, and this has been mentioned before, and I'm going to use this as a jumping off point to you, Jane, about how the Taliban in many cases does still care about this international pressure. And so Jane, my question to you from the chat box, someone wants to know about the unity within the Taliban itself. How united are they, or are there internal divisions that will exacerbate their ability to navigate this terrain where, you know, the international pressure comes in? One faction of the Taliban feels one way, one faction feels the other. How do you see that shaking out in terms of the unity within the Taliban itself?
It's a really good question, and you know, the short answer to is the Taliban unified is no, and never really have been. The Taliban, you know, some of the answers that you'll get when you talk to experts on the Taliban will be, well, what do you mean by the Taliban? And this has been going on for years. You know, the group has never been entirely homogenous. It has. That doesn't mean that on the battlefield it hasn't had a great sense of discipline. Like, the Taliban is unified in its battlefield discipline, in its central authorities, in its ability, in its fighters carrying out their orders. But it's different at the top. It's different when it gets to be political. So the Taliban is very much so divided at the top. I mean, they haven't even managed themselves to prevent the kind of leaks that damage regular governments around the world since they took Kabul. Kabul. They've had, splits between the Haqqani network and other elements within the Taliban. Power struggles the day they walked into Kabul. Power struggles around which groups were going to go into the city and secure it. I think it's likely that the Taliban themselves weren't even expecting to take Kabul so quickly. They, of course, now I spent time with the Taliban in 2019 and in 2020, less than two and a half hour drive outside of Kabul in areas that they controlled. And of course, there was a lot of confidence, especially after signing the deal with Trump, that, they were eventually going to be coming into Kabul to take over. But I don't think any of them expected to be marching in that very day in mid-August. So that impacted their readiness to know who would be in charge of what, who's going to get which ministry. And I think that the more extreme and the more shocking the moves the Taliban have made, the more I think it's been clear that they're really desperate to stay unified in the face of difficulty doing so. For instance, having people known as members or affiliated with Al-Qaeda running ministries, not announcing government positions that include almost none of the ethnic diversity of the country. I think these things show the desperate need to try to keep that unity, and therefore show that they're struggling to do so. After 20 years of war, movements like the Taliban are under pressure to dole out payback. They've got people coming to them saying, "Hey, we've been fighting for 20 years. Where's the rule that you promised us? Where is our payback for all of that?" That's increasingly difficult to do while you have ISIS also growing across the whole country, and in a way that's much more rapid since the United States left. So ISIS can come in and potentially recruit away fighters, or more of a threat to the Taliban, recruit commanders and the fighters who come underneath them, and so they're under massive pressure. They're not united, and I think that the huge efforts that they're going to stay united, which in many ways make it harder for them to run a country in an effective way, show us how much their leadership is very self-aware of this problem.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Palwasha, we have a question about healthcare. The person wants to know, will the Taliban allow women healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, etc., to continue to care for patients, male and female? And will the same restrictions be applied to outside organizations such as Doctors Without Borders?
I think that's a good question. There was no uniformity of Taliban recruitment of women. In some places, as I said, even some NGOs are working. Our workers in some provinces are working, which are female, but in some places they are not allowed. For any uniformity, I think they have to take a state decision and announce it that women can do this or that. But generally in health sector, I think there will be more possibility of flexibility. So for any international institution like Beyond Border, they have been working before in Afghanistan, the doctors in some of the very conservative communities in Southeast, and they were doing a great job. They have very good local reputation, and I think and the main threat at that time were Taliban, and now that there's a turnover and Taliban in government, I think there probably is greater possibility for that kind of intervention.
Wonderful.
If I could jump in just yes, quickly with a quick anecdote from on the ground, and what I saw in the hospitals in Herat and Kabul, and what the women who were working there were telling me was that the Taliban are very, like, they make it hard for women in many professions, or simply don't allow them to go to work. But with the health sector, they're allowing women to work, at least in the maternity wards that I had visited, because they need women to work with female patients. There seems to be a realism there about the need for that. But I've spoken with female doctors who have said, look, we're also massively losing talent. It doesn't matter whether we're allowed to work or not. Many female, medical workers who are well educated have left the country. And I spoke with one doctor in Kabul who's a gynecologist and an incredibly celebrated one whose own 14-year-old daughter can't go to school now. So she's faced with the situation of, if you're a woman and you're an educated medical professional and your daughters can't even go to school, are you going to try to stay in the country, or are you going to try to leave and take a job in India or Pakistan? And so there's a massive brain drain as well, even though the Taliban have eased up a little bit on female medical workers.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent point, and one that I think, from my understanding, a lot of organizations outside the country that have been helping women leave are now grappling with, how does that impact the country if we're now contributing to this massive brain drain? But that I wish we had more time to delve into that. Right now, I'll finish with one question, and I'll start with Lina, and I'll give it to all of you. But the question is, what can social and feminist movements, or even individuals, do in solidarity at this moment?
I think that's the right question to end on. And that's the one that we should be asking every day. And I would say take our cue from Afghan women and Afghan women's rights groups who are on the ground and in the country, and also those who are in exile, who are channeling support and resources. Amplify the work that's being done, provide funding in the ways that we're able to do so. Remember that it needs to be long-term and meaningful, covering operational costs, not restricted based on projects and quick impact short-term stuff, the way we usually allocate funding. So, donors and individuals really need to change their mindset and their funding modalities, and also be in it for the long haul, because this isn't going to be a short-term effort. It needs to be done in a way that is really meaningful if we're going to impact some change. And I think, Palawasha should really have the last word on this one, because no one knows it better and no one feels it more strongly. But I think we all should stand at the ready to do whatever it takes, and this time do it right.
Yeah. Jane, a journalist perspective, what do you think?
Force the Taliban to deal with women. Every time the World Health Organization or a UN body sends a delegation to Afghanistan, put women front and center and invite Afghan women, whether or not they're living abroad or they're inside Afghanistan, invite them to become part of the delegation, make the Taliban sit with them, look them in the eye and talk to them, have their photographs taken with them, normalize women coming from the diplomatic community, from powerful positions, from places that have funding and money and something to offer, and as much as you can, try to make them Afghan women and make the Taliban deal with them, because that's one little point of leverage. I'm so tired of seeing delegations greeted on the tarmac of Kabul airport and they're all men in suits.
Thank you. And Palawasha, to you for the final word.
I think I love both the recommendation, what's already said. It's important to that any engagement should be informed by Afghan reality, and that reality should be defined by Afghan women themselves with any groups. But we also have to be very practical in terms of our funding, supporting the way the whole issue of transaction, the sanctions, or if impact on the transaction of money, for instance, inside Afghanistan, like how to maybe package support in small aid program for women groups, for instance, to exist, be sustained, but also to maintain their reputation, their trust with the communities where they have been working. That's very much needed, that legacy to remain of all the 20 years of international engagement that has happened in Afghanistan. We cannot let these organizations to die, and with that, the efforts that women has put together for years. There are organizations like AWAC, we have 30 years of experience, and we should not let that die out. The role of these organizations should be taken in importance, and we should keep all the reality of today with a lot of things, including the financing, which is a huge hurdle or problem in the way the support should go to Afghanistan. So this should be based on the current reality. For instance, the use of Hawala and other local system, which can help small transaction to go inside Afghanistan. And yeah, with that, I would stop.
Thank you. And if we, just because we have a minute left, I'd love to just hear from you really quickly. Pawasha, what the Afghan Women's Educational Center is doing right now. I think it might be useful for everyone who's on the call to hear.
Humanitarian assistance is been one of the main focus in these days that AWEC's activity has been diverted to. Having said that, I would say that right now I've also took a different responsibility with Georgetown University and with Women, Peace and Security Institute. As a senior fellow there, and I hope that I have the opportunity to sustain and maintain my contact and support to AWEC and several other women groups inside Afghanistan.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Pawasha. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Lina. You've all been remarkable. It's clearly a situation that we should and will continue to follow. And I just want to thank you all for the work that you're doing in all these different spaces to advocate for women, for girls, for understanding on the ground. It's incredibly valuable. So I really appreciate it. Thank you everyone for the wonderful questions. Our next briefing is not until the 2022. So we have globalization and the supply chain crisis. So with that, I will say, best of luck, stay healthy in the wrap up to 2021, and please do continue to follow the work of all our wonderful panelists. You've been fantastic. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Courtney.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.